Welcome, folks. Good afternoon. My name is Joe McCartan. I'm the Executive Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. And welcome to this afternoon's panel, Bargaining for the Common Good and the Development of a Social Compact for K through 12 Education. This panel is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to everyone as they share their links with us, and we will have that ready later today. It's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. We are lucky to have moderating this great panel a fantastic historian of the teacher union movement named John Shelton. He's the author of a book called Teacher Strike. And we're delighted to have John with us. John?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to everybody for being here. This is really an exciting, sort of bigger conversation that we're having with this convening, and a conversation, a really exciting conversation we're going to have today. We have, for this session on bargaining for the common good, three really dynamic speakers and dynamic leaders, really. I'm going to introduce them all before we get into the conversation. I want to let everybody know that we'll have time to take your questions and comments, so feel free to put them in the chat. But first of all, I'm delighted to say that we have Randy Weingarten here, who is president of the American Federation of Teachers. Randy began her career as an attorney and then a classroom teacher in New York City from 1991 to 97. Elected president of the United Federation of Teachers in 1998, which, if you don't know, is the New York City local. And in 2008 became president of the AFT. Since that time, Randy has really just become one of the most important voices for the labor movement and for public education. And I just have to say, you know, full disclosure, I'm a AFT member here in Wisconsin, and I've just deeply admired her leadership as president of my union, you know, where I think she's really made a case for balancing the necessity for teacher safety during this health crisis with the needs of students and the future of public education. So we've got Randy here. Second, we have Terrence Martin, who's president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers. Terrence was born and raised in Detroit, which, aside from its football team, which I have to point out being from Green Bay, is otherwise a terrific city. Terrence was a second grade teacher before being elected treasurer and then executive vice president of the DFT before being elected president in 2018. He also serves on the Michigan Education Justice Coalition and the 13th Congressional District Democratic Committee. And then third, we have Marche Doss. Marche is a second-year student at Santa Monica College. She was a youth organizer for an organization called Students Deserve, which was an instrumental force in the 2019 LA teacher strike. Students Deserve was able to push racial justice and student rights at the forefront of the union's contract demands there. And we're thrilled to have her there, to have her with us today, as we're thrilled to have all three of our panelists. So I'm going to start off by asking a few framing questions and get our panel talking. But again, feel free to add other things you'd like to talk about in the chat. So I wanted to start off with just a super quick conversation of bargaining for the common good. And, you know, as we're thinking about a new social contract, you know, I'm really reminded, and something I've been thinking a lot about recently, particularly given the presidential administration, is FDR's call for a second Bill of Rights in 1944. And in short, what FDR argued after more than a decade of depression and war and reform was that Americans had accepted what he called a second Bill of Rights that called for public goods like the right to a job and healthcare and housing and education to be at the forefront of the nation's priorities. Now, as we know, I'm guessing most of us here know this, these rights were never fully guaranteed for working Americans in the years since. And in fact, conservatives over the past half century have worked to weaken those guarantees. But right now, I think we're in a moment where clearly where working Americans are demanding more. And Joe Biden's speech last night, I think, is evident of the demands from working people that have pushed mainstream politicians to take these calls seriously. And I think one reason for this is because of the work teacher unions have done to organize around those demands. And so bargaining for the common good is a big part of that. Although the term is relatively new, the concept, I think, has a much longer history. It essentially means that workers, especially those in public sector unions, use the collective bargaining process as a way to advance the economic and social needs of other working people in the community. And so in recent years, we've seen this strategy used very effectively to do everything from fighting to limit standardized tests and mitigating racially inequitable school discipline practices to fighting to ensure millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share of taxes. So I'd like to just start off, and I'm going to start with Randy, but I'd like to start off by asking each of our panelists to reflect just sort of broadly on the concept of bargaining for the common good. And so, Randy, I'll start with you. As president, I know you've long been a proponent of bargaining for the common good. And so I'd like you if you would, to start off by letting us know what it means to you and what are some of the ways the way AFT has prioritized it over the past few decades. Did we lose you? Randy, are you there? You're muted.
Problem, I think.
Oh, she has an issue hearing. Okay. All right. Well, maybe.
We weren't allowed to unmute ourselves.
Okay. Okay.
So I almost got through writing that in the chat, and then abracadabra.
Terrific.
Technology is an amazing thing. So first of all, let me just say I'm honored to be with Terrence and Marche. Watching Marche at the work in LA, it gives you the confidence to understand, it gives you the hope to understand that a creed that we now have, which is together we can accomplish what is impossible to do alone. And so, John, I think that, let me just kind of go back and riff a little bit on what you said about safety and what has happened since FDR. There's kind of two strands in America. One about how the quest for having public goods and having this sense of the work we do for the common good and that it will lift all is in some ways how FDR and how Johnson pre-Vietnam were able to move huge rafts of or huge pieces of public policy. That was contrasted with the Reagan sense that, of just the obeisance to the marketplace, and that, and you can actually see it as a social studies teacher, captains of industry versus robber barons. These two kind of threads of, do we do things to level the playing field and create opportunity for all that then all thrive on? Or is it, I'm pulling myself up by the bootstraps, and if you can't, then that means you're not worthy. And those two kind of concepts have fought with each other a lot in America. And in some ways, unions can be in both camps. And what we've tried to do with bargaining for the common good is to say, no, we have to be part of how we lift up communities. And the way in which we have sold it, I mean, you don't have to sell it to our members anymore, but the way in which we started, frankly, UFT in the 1960s, more effective schools. Teachers want what children need. And then the other side was, oh, no, you're just for the teachers. The management is for the children. But it's not true. It is everything that happens, and this is how we've talked to our members about it. Everything that happens in a classroom that shows up in a community shows up in a classroom. And if we really believe in educating all kids and helping all kids get to their potential and have access to the American dream, then we have to actually deal with all the other issues. We can't just deal with one little slice of it. We have to deal with housing. We have to deal with transportation. We have to deal with emotional and social issues and meet all children's needs. And I would argue, meet families' needs. And that's why you start seeing the unions start fighting for community schools and wraparound services and fighting to stop evictions and fighting to actually have a proper role of security, not have a school to prison pipeline. But what happened was we had to actually show it to people. And that's how, and using the bargaining, and I'm going to stop here. We used the bargaining process in New York when I was the local leader very intentionally before anybody called it bargaining for the common good. We did it in District 9 as well as in the Chancellor's District, where we said it is our responsibility to help make sure that schools actually meet the needs of all kids, particularly Black and brown kids and poor kids. And we worked with community on those demands, and then we brought those demands to the bargaining table. And the empowerment that has happened by doing that was amazing. But you see it then in the stories of St. Paul, in the stories of LA, Chicago, and then in the teacher strikes in 2018. But you have to find ways that people see that our responsibility is not simply what we're told to do as school teachers, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Our responsibility is to all of the community. And you have to spend some time actually finding ways that people buy into that concept, and that concept becomes the norm, not the exception, which I would argue it has become in AFT locals throughout the country.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really helpful framing as we move forward in this conversation. So I really appreciate that. Terrence, I want to move to you for a second here. And I know that, you're president of a union in a city that's been really hard hit by systematic capital flight and, political choices that have been made to defund public institutions. Could you let us know a little bit about how the Detroit Federation of Teachers has used bargaining for the common good strategies to fight for the needs of working people, broadly speaking, like all working people in the city in Detroit?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. And I think what you just outlined, John, is about half of what we've gone through here in Detroit. When you talk about what's happened to public education in the city of Detroit, you got to go back to the district losing an elected school board, losing the ability to democratically elect folks who serve and make policy and control our school district, along with losing local control and it being our school district being a state ran district. You got to go back there. And then also massive layoffs, defunding of education, closures of schools, and schools that were in parts of our city where those schools were a hub of that neighborhood. So you lose the school, you lose the neighborhood. And so it's really a systematic dismantling of not only public education, but the democratic process for people who have traditionally been marginalized. So it gets deeper when you really dissect what has happened in Detroit. So one of the things that we've tried to do in our local is really look at how we engage community at the bargaining table. And we're not talking about a one-off. We're talking about, hey, I meet with constituency groups within my local to see what things they want us to fight for at the table. We do the same with community leaders. We do the same with students. We do the same with community groups when it comes bargaining time. Because what it does is unions oftentimes are the last line of defense for a community. In any way that we can show and make change for the community in our collective bargaining agreement, we take every opportunity to do so. Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's always easy and it always works. This is hard work. We've been trying to get ourselves to this point for a number of years, and a lot of hard and tough conversations go along with that. A lot of the union taking ownership of not doing it in the past. A lot of reckoning that comes along with that. It makes members uncomfortable. They tell you as a leader, you should be fighting for the things that we want, not for the things that the community wants. You're the president of the DFT, not the president of Detroit. So I get that a lot. But when you're convicted by making sure, and Randy touched on this, when you're convicted by making sure, and you understand that we don't just teach children, we service families. When you're convicted by that, you have to take every step necessary to ensure that those families thrive. And this pandemic, and I'm sure we're going to get to that in this conversation, but this pandemic has really shown us how important schools are. During this pandemic, we fed children, we've clothed families, we fed families. We're testing communities and neighborhoods. We're vaccinating communities and neighborhoods, and it's all happening at schools. And so those things don't happen without the collective bargaining process, the guarantees that it brings, and truly engaging community in that process.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Marche now for a second. And Marche, one of the things that's come out about the LA teacher strike, I think, when sort of national pundits were looking at this, there wasn't a ton of reporting on the way that different community allies were supporting the teachers there, and their struggle for not just better schools, but a freer and more democratic, community in Los Angeles. So I know, students played, from everything that has come out on this recently, we've learned that students have played a really important role in helping the teachers in LA fight for the needs of the whole community in 2019. And, so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you and Students Deserve got connected to the United Teachers of Los Angeles and the contract fight there. And, and then maybe you could also tell us what were some of the things that students really wanted to see out of the bargaining process, and how you worked with the union to advocate for those demands.
Thank you so much for this wonderful question and for having me here. I'm so excited. First, I would like to start off by saying that during this time, students wanted to see a change in the way that we were being treated. And we were tired of, at the time, our campaign to end random searches, which is the process of which school staff members are made to go into classrooms, and every student has to put their hands directly on the table like this, across where your hands, you can see them, while they pick 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, who will be searched and who will be pulled out of classes. And we know that this isn't random, because factors as in how many times you've been put into the deans, whether your jeans are sagging, and really like what you look like is a part of being chosen, which is a part of like being picked at random. So we've seen that LAUSD, the Los Angeles Unified School District, was using random searches as a scapegoat for the irrefutable fact that LAUSD did not make students their priority. Have you ever heard the saying, put your money where your mouth is? Well, apparently LAUSD did not, because they were saying, we care about you, we care about your safety, but they put us in an environment with tools to fail more than to succeed. And during that time leading up to the strike, we learned that LAUSD was spending over $80 million to keep school police and $1 million every school year for random searches. Now I need you to please keep these numbers in mind because they are very crucial. Students Deserve is a grassroots coalition led by youth, supported by teachers, parents, and community members. As we were building power together and growing and delivering over 17,000 buttons to support our campaign to end random searches and to stop criminalizing students, it was so big to the point where if you didn't have one, you knew someone who did, to where you were walking down the street and you just seen like this random person wearing a button that you had never seen before or even knew about your campaign. Our message was spreading really wide, and we invited UTLA to come to our big events where we would share our testimonies about the psychological and emotional effect of having anti-Black policies in our school and at the magnitude that they were. So remember those numbers from earlier: $80 million for school police, $1 million for random searches. LAUSD was spending just a little over $11,000 per student. This clearly shows where their priorities were. We had no soap in the bathrooms, overcrowded classrooms, no access to a full-time nurse or librarian. Sometimes schools could only see them for 2 days a week, or even one less if they didn't have the amount of funding that was needed to fund to have a nurse. We had little to no access to our academic counselors or college counselors, but they made sure that we kept these anti-Black policies in full effect in the name of keeping us safe while simultaneously sending us down the school to prison pipeline. Teachers have seen the things that we've been going through and the things that we go to the school board to talk about because they are the ones that are on campus with us, which is really where UCLA comes into play. Teachers supported us fighting for our well-being, and the UTLA president at the time, Alex Caputo-Pearl, he uplifted our messages like so many others when the school board wasn't budging to our outcry. But UTLA did. They agreed to stand in solidarity with us and to fight with us, and we worked hand in hand in getting some resources, not all of the resources that we wanted because it is a process, but they helped us in getting some of the major resources that we wanted, but not only that we wanted, but the resources that we need. And while the bargaining team was inside applying the pressure in the boardroom, we were outside with our other coalition partners like BLM Los Angeles, Ross LA, Lane, ACE, along with parents and community members. We went to the school board members' houses, like knock knock at their doorstep, with over like 50,000 people. We marched up hills. We went to their doorstep with news teams and news crew to really show everyone that this is what's happening. We went to the school board, they ignored us. We did one-on-one meetings, they ignored us. We decided to be partners with United Teachers Los Angeles, and they were like, maybe you guys have a little bit of power here. We got our teachers and our other major community members, our parents, to all be involved and to go to the school board all together at one time, to go to these houses all together at one time to show our strength and our power in our community. And we were able to get full-time nurses and librarians, some of the major things. We got a lot more things, but some of the key things I believe that we won were full-time nurses and librarians. We were able to get a class size cap, reducing class sizes by 1 to 2 students every year, because at first they were trying to raise it up to like 55 students in a classroom, which is freaking ridiculous. But we were able to get that reduced by 1 to 2 students every year. And then at the end of that, we were able to get into random searches all over LAUSD. And so that was big in play into the community relationships that we were able to build throughout building power throughout our campaign.
That's really awesome, Marche. And one of the things that really resonated with me as a teacher is, the fact that, students and teachers work together to advocate for these things that, really make teachers more effective, right? So, I mean, to be an effective teacher, you want your students to be free from racial discrimination and the trauma of, those deeply inequitable searches that you mentioned. And so, I think it's tremendous to see that students were able to work with the union to advocate and win on that issue. That's really great. And the many of the things you brought up, I think, leads into another question that I wanted to talk more specifically about, which is to connect more squarely to racial justice. And so I'm gonna start with Terrence on this one, actually. But one of my heroes is the great labor leader and civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, who was sort of one of the architects of the March on Washington. And one of the most important Americans in the 20th century. I think that a lot of Americans don't know who he is. But in 1966, he and Bayard Rustin, another civil rights and union rights advocate, proposed something called the Freedom Budget that would guarantee a good job to everybody who wanted to work, universal health care, good housing, clean water, and education. And what Randolph and Rustin argued, and I think they did this brilliantly, is that they argued that racial equality and economic rights for everyone go hand in hand, and we have to think about them as being linked. And so I'd like, every panelist to reflect on that. And as we move forward, how do you see these two goals sort of working together in the efforts of unions to bargain for the common good? And so another way to think about this is like, what should we be doing moving forward to strongly connect those things, particularly in a moment where, we're having an open conversation about what our national recovery from COVID looks like. And so I'd like to start with Terrence and your thoughts on this from the Detroit perspective. And then go ahead.
I certainly think that both of these things are inexplicably linked. When you look at to take the example that Marche gave about school districts' budgets and where the money is being spent. We're really pushing right now in Detroit to move money from our public safety budget into classrooms. And we often talk about the learning gap that exists with cities such as Detroit. We're the blackest and the poorest city in the country. And we often talk about the struggles of the people there and the district and the city. And what we say is there's this education gap here. It'll take years for us to close this gap. And I somewhat disagree with that. What I would say is that there's an opportunity and an access gap. Our students are able to learn at just high rates as their suburban counterparts, but they haven't been given the opportunity, and we don't have the access, and financially the money just isn't there. So what we really should be talking about is how do we provide access and opportunity to marginalized communities? And that's really the conversation. And so when you're talking about making sure that a kid from the east side of Detroit has an opportunity to access skilled trades, has an opportunity to access what it's like to work in the green industry, has an opportunity to access how to create an app and not have to go to an after-school program to do it because he doesn't have the transportation or the funds to get there and to pay for it, but having it a part of the regular school curriculum so that every child has access to these sorts of programs. And so that's really the spirit of what I take from great activists such as Bayard Rustin. And what they were really saying was, we've got to have the same opportunity and the same access and the access to capital to pay for these things and to fund them so that we have an opportunity to exceed and achieve the American dream just like everyone else.
Thank you so much for that. Randy, I'd like you to reflect on that question, if you wouldn't mind.
So I'm glad you said both Bayard and A. Philip Randolph, because Bayard was, Bayard was very close friends. They were almost like brothers and sisters to my mentor, Sandy Feldman. And so I was pretty lucky in the beginning of the time that I was at the UFT to be able to actually learn from him. you know, and I was very pleased that with A. Philip Randolph and the Institute and others, during the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, we had a very special night where we honored Bayard Rustin and for his role in the March on Washington, which, as you know, John, and others know, Randolph tried to get to be earlier, several years earlier. And the march itself was focused on jobs and justice, which is as important today as it was then. But Randolph understood through the struggles, as did Rustin, that the meal ticket out of poverty was a union. And that part of the fight for equality was obviously dismantling the oppressive systems of inequity and racism. And that was really important. But it was also fighting for a ladder of opportunity so that people could have a good wage and could have conditions at work where they were not unsafe, and that there could be conditions for work and for school. There could be free, think about the City University of New York, free college. There could be conditions that leveled the playing field and created equity. And there was lots of experiments. Wisconsin was a place where there was a bunch of experiments. New York City, New York State, pre the fiscal crisis, Detroit. So there was lots of ways of where there was a meshing between the dismantlement of Jim Crow and de jure segregation, but also a fight against de facto segregation and a fight for economic and educational opportunity. And Randolph understood that you couldn't just have the power of doing this politically to dismantle that which was enshrined in law. And you also needed to change things culturally and societally, which frankly, Marseille's story about what happened in LA is a perfect modern day example of that, from thinking that schools had to be no excuses, climate meant that you had this kind of you had this kind of penitentiary sense of climate versus a sense of all of us need to have a safe, welcoming environment, and getting the union involved with students in showing not only that what was happening was wrong, but she changed and the students changed hearts and minds. But so it's, taking on the structures, taking on the change of culture. But it was also, the third piece is this empowerment of workers to actually have more of a slice of the economic pie. And that's where Randolph was so brilliant in understanding it had to be all three. And where Bayard was in some ways his disciple on all of this, and where part of what I think we need to do more and more is that we have to be engaged in the real work and discussions and real collaboration that the labor movement and the civil rights movement did in the 60s, and few people know about it. But it was real collaboration and real work that Randolph really made sure we had the muscle to do. That's the work that Students Deserve and UTLA did together in the run up, not only to the strike, but in the changing of policing in schools. That work, that real collaborative work, it doesn't mean that we're always going to agree on everything all the time, but we are real partners. We are engaging in a real way. And we then become we then become much more of a force. That's what Randolph and Rustin and the others involved in the March on Washington really taught us. And that's the lesson that I take from him, not just the sound bites, but what is the infrastructure that you need and the partnerships and the coalitions that you need to actually march together.
Yeah, that's so profound. And you know, what really resonated with me there is that historical context, and also something that, you know, connected to what Terrence said, which is that, you know, unions and the community might not always agree, but they can do the work. They can have these tough conversations, and out of that you can find a path forward where you can, you know, collaborate and work together, you know, where you do actually have probably more common ground than might be sort of immediately apparent. Marche, I'd like you to, as a young person, reflect on this. I mean, how do you see, and don't feel like you have to, you know, get into the historical stuff, but how do you see the connection between racial equality and economic justice for young people? What should we be thinking about?
So yes, thanks for this question again. And I would say that I agree with Randy and Terrence that this is something that we have to do all together as a collective. It can't, you know, we're all connected. One person can't just be working on this one thing over here without these, you know, there's moving pieces. We're all connected, and even though we don't agree on everything, we should be able to work in community together to uplift our community, which is something that we all want, even if we don't see eye to eye. And so I would say that we were able to actually use what you were talking about in LA, do the contract fight and the strike that happened in 2019, where we were fighting for smaller class sizes, more counselors, more nurses, more librarians. But really, the students were the ones who were like, hey, this is what's happening. And although we need all of these other things, we also need you to take up this additional racial component that's happening in our schools, this criminalization that's happening through random searches and the over policing. And we were able to join forces with UTLA and other major community partners to be a part of it. And we were able to accomplish and fight and win for the things that we wanted together as a collective. And then we're doing it again now. LAUSD spends entirely too much money policing. I told you before that it was $80 million, particularly policing Black students, and they're not investing that money into our education, into our futures. And so now we're working together again with United Teachers Los Angeles to fight to reduce the amount of money being spent and reinvest those funds into services for particularly Black students. And so we were able to accomplish a major victory in completing and creating, a Black student achievement plan. And it is so awesome because we were able to win $25 million that's divested from LASPD that goes to 53 schools with the largest number of Black students to support over 13,000 Black students, as well as all of those students that are in those schools, plus an additional 13 million in funds for counselors and PSWs. And then we got additional funding for 10 targeted schools to become community schools. And I'm sure all of us on this call know what community schools are, but they're a school that provides wraparound services for students, and they're completely flexible and adaptable to your students and your community, which is the greatest thing that you can ever ask a school to have. I don't think that it should have a special name. I think all schools should be this way because all students are different, all communities are different, and we work and we learn in different ways, and we have different needs to meet. And so that's why I think community schools are so great. And we were able to win funding for 10 additional schools on top of the ones that we were already able to win, which was 30. So in order to keep these things intact and hold our school district accountable, we were able to win also creating a Black Student Achievement Steering Committee to oversee the implementation and accountability that students deserve. UTLA and other community partners are on really holding the district accountable for what they said that they were going to do. And then lastly, we were able to win no cops stationed on any school campus, which is the biggest that we can ask for right now and that we weren't even expecting, you know. We're going to keep fighting and achieving more, but right now that's what we were able to win. And we were able to win using exactly what you said, by focusing on our social and economic backgrounds.
That's terrific. Thank you. It's amazing. I know Terrence has to leave in just a couple of minutes. That's the perils of having such a great group of enormously involved folks. He's got to go to a negotiating meeting. But I wanted to ask one more question, and I'll ask Terrence to go first if you have just another minute. I think one of the issues that we've had in American politics over the past few decades is, this is me personally, so folks can feel free to disagree with me, but I feel like too much we've expected our education system to largely serve to facilitate human capital, to give students job skills at the expense of, and I'm not saying that's not important at all, but at the expense of other functions of the public education system, right? So education for democracy, as an example. And so I wanted to ask Terrence to reflect on that first, and maybe it's super quick, but what is it that your teachers see as important for their students to get out of public education?
Well, I think it certainly extends beyond learning the very basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But I think it really extends beyond to really utilizing high-level thinking skills and learning how to learn, and utilizing what's happening in our world today, and be able to relate to it, to synthesize with it, to understand it, and to change it for the better. Gone are the days that I think that we allow or don't allow for the world to seep into a classroom, meaning that if there's uprising, civil uprising, and racial injustice that's happening, that we don't talk about that in our classroom. We've got to be able to do that. That when we see historical trials like the trial with George Floyd, that we don't look at that and study that in our classrooms. Those have got to be really the standards that we utilize moving forward in this country. Because what will happen is, if we don't tackle those situations, and if we don't talk about them, and if we're not trained to deal with racial injustice, if we're not trained to deal with oppression and have anti-oppression training for our teachers and our staff, then what we'll find is that we'll see what we've seen in 2020. And we won't know how to process that, and we will bring forth children that are going to, because they're going to do it anyway. Children are going to figure out a way to respond to these social ills. Let's utilize this as an opportunity to really pull them together and really understand exactly what's happening in our country.
That's terrific, Terrence. Thank you so much. I know you've got a busy schedule, and we appreciate you being here today. Randy, I want to go to you, and I want to be a little more explicit about what I'm trying to ask here. I kind of rushed through that because I knew Terrence had to go. But I think, and I know you know this. I mean, we're at a moment where we've had decades of education reform, that so-called reform that blames teachers for not, I don't know, giving students the right skills to succeed in a deeply unequal economy. And so I think that we've had a lot of policymakers expect education to do these things that in and of itself it's incapable of doing. And at the same time, that's led to a narrowing of this pressure to narrow the curriculum and to force teachers to teach the test. And I feel like this is a question we got to get right if we're thinking about a new social compact. I mean, what do you see as the role of public education in a democratic society?
So I'm actually giving a speech that bears on this in a couple of weeks. I don't normally announce these things in advance, but in the whole safety fight, Dana Goldstein asked me, was I going to give a speech on this in an article she was doing, and I said yes, but I waited because that question weighs on me and weighs on all of us. So let me answer it in kind of like, it take me a couple of minutes. Let me answer it in 3 or 4 different parts. Number one, we've had 20 years. So let me do the more provocative answer first, and then the whys. We've had basically 20 or 25 years, starting with No Child Left Behind, before No Child Left Behind, all the governors getting together and saying Standards 2000, and, basically wanting schooling to be a very effective way of kids basically reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so it became a pool of workers who could work in the economy of the turn of the century, in the 2000s, the early 2000s. Forgetting completely that and I say this hesitantly because, Jefferson had lots of issues. Jefferson was a slave owner. But if you look back at Jefferson's work, not just in the Declaration of Independence, again, I'm a social studies teacher, what can I do? But there was a push and a discussion, not only in the Declaration, leading up to the Declaration, but leading up to the Constitution, about education. And education became a piece that every single state put education in their state constitution, because the point was not to prepare kids for college or career, but it was to prepare young adults for civic participation. So the very point that the founders said was so important about what we prepared kids for, by the 2000, we're like, oh no, we're not talking about civic education. We're talking about reading, writing, arithmetic. So we have people who come and person our, our businesses. Look, we need to do both, but even more than that, what COVID did and showed us, but what any student or any teacher or any parent would tell you, is we need to help kids develop life skills. We need to help kids be able to have a hope and an aspiration and resilience and develop relationships and have the muscle to critically think. There's a whole bunch of stuff that schools need to do. And one of the things that we saw in COVID was that the social isolation has been what has been so devastating for everyone. The joy that people have as they're going back to in-person learning, seeing each other, having community, the relationships. So frankly, it gets you to the point that school is for a lot of everything. School is a place where we are hoping we inculcate the skills and knowledge and, so that, and social dispositions and all sorts of other things, so that kids can thrive. And that when you fall down, we can find ways of getting people back up. To have the confidence to soar, that takes a lot more than teaching to the test. And what COVID also showed people is that schools are pretty important for all of these things. That's why people want them reopened in person, because it's important. It's foundational to community. It's foundational to democracy. It's foundational to our economy. So we have to actually give up the ghost and say, oh no, school is only for this very narrow purpose. Schools are for a lot of big purposes in our society, our communities. We have to give them the resources and teachers the support and kids the support so that we can do all that we need to accomplish. So that means you got to change the accountability system, because we got an accountability system that's about teaching math and English, that's aligned to, you know, the skills to be able to get into college in 2000. We got to actually move from that to, let's have an accountability system that follows what we need to do, which is to actually make sure that kids are prepared for life, college, career, civic engagement, and have a lot of joy and fun in doing that. That's what we really should be doing. And that's what this reimagining moment should enable us to do.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I really appreciate the way that you connected that to the impetus from so many quarters to reopen schools, right? And I think, you know, that's been such a tremendously important conversation right now, because rightly so, teachers are worried about their health and their safety. But I think it's so critical that we think about why it is that so many people want schools open, right? And I think articulating that it's part of our basic civic fabric of democracy is so significant. So thank you for that. Marche, I want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, John, about my dog, but let me just say one more thing about this. Penny, stop. But which is, safety was a way of reopening. It's the path to reopen. It's not an either or. It was a both and. And I think that we've gotten to a point. Sorry about the dog. I'll stop now. We think that we've gotten to a point that we know what the roadmap is to make sure that we can robustly have back to school in August and September.
That's great. Marche, I want to turn to you on this question. So I teach a lot of students. Many of them are first generation college students, and in a lot of the conversations I have with them, they feel like, you know, they're anxious about their futures. They feel overwhelmed. Their high school experience was one where they took a lot of standardized tests. Almost everybody says that they took too many standardized tests. They're worried about getting good jobs when they graduate, what kind of careers are going to be available to them. You know, they fear that they're going to be burdened by student debt. Is that the experience that you have, and that other people that young people that you're organizing with have? I mean, how do you see this question about, you know, the role of the public education system?
Yes. I have to take a real deep breath with that one, because that is something that me and my friends, we talk about all the time, about not being prepared well enough for the real world, for finances, for career choices, for school loans, for saving, what even a saving plan is, or having a retirement plan and the steps that you need to take to achieve that. And on top of that, on top of worrying about whether or not you're going to succeed, or if you have, even not just succeeding, because we can know that we're really smart and we can know that we're really great and that we can do anything that we want to do. But if we don't have the financial part of it to sustain, like, you know, this is how this world runs. If we don't have enough money to pay our rent, then we're houseless. If we don't have enough money to put food in our bellies, then we're starving. And so it's a really big part of our lives. But on top of that, we're also concerned about the over-policing that's happening in our communities. And I know I mentioned earlier about over-policing that's happening in schools, but they really tie hand in hand, because what's happening out in our communities is being spilled into our schools. And every time, it feels like every time we look up at our phones, at our screens to watch anything on Instagram or social media, it's a video correlating to police brutality. And in this day and age where now everything is caught on camera, we have to literally see Black people dying. And it is heartbreaking. Every time it feels like one day someone is dying and we're on the streets and we're screaming and we're yelling and we're chanting and we're trying to get people to see. And there are cops out here literally killing us for running, for freaking sleeping in our car, for being in poverty, for even just being in your home, for freaking going to the gym. People are dying. Black people are dying. I'm sorry. All this to say is that on top of the pressure of needing to sustain your life and your livability, you also have to worry about if you're just gonna die for trying to do that. And then there's this pressure of capitalistic society and the economic system and this hustle culture of like, you need to go, you need to make money. And what are the ways that you can make money? Oh, you have this pencil here, sell this pencil. Even if you sell 100 of them, you can make $100. Like, everything is about how to make a buck. And every year, the age of success drops lower. It's not no longer, well, you're successful if you do this and that by 30. And then it's you're successful if you do it by 25. And then you're successful if you do it by 22. And now it's like you're successful if you do it by 15. And it's really pushing money over everything onto us, that it's draining us, and we don't have the necessary materials, or we never gained the necessary materials to teach us about burnout, to teach us about mental health, and to teach us how to care about ourselves, and putting ourselves first, while also, living in community and caring about other people. And so I would like to see our public education system be a place of new development and growth for all students. I would like to see more culturally diverse curriculum for all students, not just an auditorium assembly that happens once a year, Black History Month, that almost always starts from a story background of slavery, as if that's where everything began. But again, I digress. But most importantly, I would like to see our youth supported by a school climate that is cultivated in love, empathy, understanding, ultimately a school that just cares for the whole student. So thank you.
Marcia, I think I speak for everybody else here when I say thank you for sharing that. I know that was, clearly difficult, but we appreciate we appreciate the vulnerability that you brought into that answer. And I think that's so helpful in thinking about where we go moving forward. And so, I have nothing to add other than to say thank you for sharing that. And I think there are more and more folks your age who are making these demands, and it's so great to see, because that's how we're going to change things. I want to ask one more quick question, and then we've got some questions in the chat. So I'm a member of a union, a higher education union in Wisconsin. We don't have collective bargaining rights. We have a union. A lot of people think we don't have a union. They're like, I thought Act 10 got rid of unions. No, it didn't. We have a union. But we can't really use bargaining for the common good technically, because we don't negotiate contracts. And so, and this doesn't have to be a long answer. I would ask Randy first here. I mean, what are some ways that, and maybe this can help us sort of take this, sort of broaden it out a little bit. What are some ways that unions who maybe don't have collective bargaining, ways that they can employ this sort of strategy of building community coalitions? And this could even go for non-unions, right? So, I mean, I think this would be good for Marcia to reflect on too, if you're open to it. But how do we sort of broaden this beyond the collective bargaining relationship to build bigger coalitions and bigger solidarities in our communities?
I would say, John, notice how in 2010, as people like Scott Walker gained power, Mitch Daniels in Indiana, Scott Walker in Wisconsin, the first thing they went after, they go after three things almost immediately. The first thing they went after was to get rid of, they couldn't get rid of the infrastructure of unions because there is a right to association under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. But they went after the power of what unions do. Collective bargaining is a pretty big, important power. Almost every bigwig we know has an employment contract with whoever that bigwig is with. I know I get in trouble sometimes when I talk about the ownership class, but that contract, that employment contract, gives that person some rights. Most of the time, most of us, in a world in America where it's basically at will employment unless you have a collective bargaining contract. It's the collective bargaining contract that creates fairness. It's a collective bargaining contract that creates rights and conditions that you can rely on, whether or not somebody even looks at their collective bargaining contract at all. And most of the time in a good employment situation, you never even look at it. But it is a power that we need to make as one of the gold standards, which is part of the reason why we keep on fighting for it. And it was so great to hear the President of the United States of America make it clear how important, when he said the middle class, not Wall Street, created America, and unions created the middle class. Now, that may be very simplistic, and it's, there's lots of things we have to do. Point to what Marche just said in her courage in the last comment. But it's not just you have or you don't have collective bargaining. Collective bargaining wasn't manna from heaven that just appeared. Wisconsin was the first state to have public sector collective bargaining, and we have to reorganize to get it. And it's also a really good way of organizing around issues of common concern, because any of us, and so I'm talking to all the kind of unionists that are on the phone, you remember this. Anytime you do a second contract, a first contract, a 25th contract, the first thing we're taught to do, I hope that it doesn't take teaching to do this, is to talk to our members about their needs and aspirations of what they want to see in their contract. And that kind of strategy is something we should be doing with any kind of issue of common concern. You're going to get the issue of common concern because it's an issue of common concern. And then you organize around that issue. And you bring people in who believe the same ways, believe that it should be solved, or that's a problem that needs to be solved. But you organize around that. And frankly, any kind of collective action, two words in collective bargaining, collective and bargaining. Nobody's going to stop us from doing collective action around issues of common concern. We can do it in the employment setting. We can do it in the community setting. In the employment setting, there may be, a boss, there may be a board of education, there may be a board of trustees, there may be a president of a community college. In the local setting, there's a whole bunch of people. There may be a city council, there may be a planning council, there's always a place to leverage these concerns. And so I would say that even if we don't have collective bargaining, which is really important as the gold standard to get, and not only on money issues, but on other terms and conditions of employment, because as I said before, in any of these settings, the conditions under which workers work are the conditions under which, in a health setting, patients are treated. In an education setting, students are learning. We can just take those same concepts of organizing around an issue that we want solved and use the same kind of strategies to kind of organize a target, coalition building. And what then happens is you start developing the muscle of being able to solve these problems. And some of that muscle is, speaking at a community event. Some of that muscle is speaking at a city council. Some of that muscle is meeting with the bosses. And some of that muscle is a rally. Some of that muscle is withholding services. Some of that muscle is petitioning. But it's the same kind of sense. Most important, the last thing I would say is don't give up. The other side takes these things away from us. Voter suppression, cutting budgets in terms of schools, getting rid of collective bargaining because they think we'll give up. Not giving up is the most important thing we can do, because together we can actually solve what we can't do individually.
Thank you. Appreciate that a lot. Marche, is there anything that you'd like to add to this question? Do you have any advice for folks trying to build community coalitions, either based on your own experience or just, things that you're kind of thinking about for the future?
Tips on building community coalitions? Okay, well, I would say that the first thing, first I want to reiterate what Randy was saying about how even if you are told no, or even if I don't know much about unions, right? But even if you are not able to collectively bargain and be a part of it, you can still organize. You can still talk to your coworkers and like subtly give them an elevator pitch on the cause that you're pushing. Even if they're like, oh, hey, not now, keep steadily dropping those elevator pitches and organizing and bringing people into this work and really making them see how it involves them too, which is very crucial in organizing work, because a lot of people are like, well, what does this have to do with me? Or like, I'm fine, I'm content where I'm at, but why do I have to care about the collective? And really showing them how it includes them, their family, how it includes their well-being into and why it's important to bargain for the collective good and be a part of organizing. And that's really crucial when building coalitions and building relationships, because like it was mentioned earlier, we may not always agree on everything, but I do believe our end goal is ultimately the same, which is to uplift our community and give our community a fighting chance to survive. And so that's what I would say when you want to build a coalition, is to talk to those members, talk to people who you think would be interested in this conversation first. And then you and that person go talk to another person, and form a group of you who are dedicated to doing this work, who is not going to take no for an answer, who is very committed to uplifting their community and the community of people around them from a loving and understanding and empathetic place. And the more you can be genuine about that process, is the more I feel like it'll naturally flow to you. It'll be put together. You have to do the work and put in the effort and not give up, and the pieces will begin to fall in place.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that's so insightful, I think one of the things that was clear in what both Randy and Marche said is that organizing, whether you have a collective bargaining relationship or not, is hard work. It's tough work. It requires persistence. And, I would just, for people watching this and taking these other doing these other sessions, these conversations about the sort of big picture ideas are really important moving forward, but none of this happens if we don't organize, if we don't organize at our workplaces, if we don't organize in our communities. And so maybe more than anything else, that's what we need to take away from this conversation. And I think, both Randy and Marche, I've been inspired by what you've had to say today. There's a couple of questions in the chat as we kind of wrap up here. So Marche, this is a question for you. In your organizing, you have been a huge part of a huge moment in our communities. Have you thought about how to make sure that student leaders can be there to step in behind you in your cohort, as you, and I know you've already aged out of the LAUSD system, but as you sort of think about building a new cohort of leaders in the future, to hold your wins, remember them, and build on them. So basically, like, how do you make sure that you've got another sort of generation of leaders, coming up behind you?
Thank you so much for this question. I was actually just talking about this earlier today. One of the things that I feel I am most blessed with and grateful to have been able to accomplish was that I got into this work when I was 16 years old, and I was able to go through this process. And now I'm able to sit here at 20 years old and see everything come full circle from when I was being mentored by someone and they were teaching me about the things to say and about why this was happening and what was wrong and helping me form ideas and talking points, to being in a spot where I'm now able to help other students do that is truly gratifying and amazing. And the way that I did it was staying involved. Even though I graduated, I stayed like very connected to students that I was working with and in partnership with while I was in high school. And we then stayed involved and just like, kind of lurked around the shadows with other students like, hey, that was really cool. You did such great work. And I'm so happy that you did this, and really giving encouragement and love to them, and really just being around, like, hey, I'm here if you need me to be here. And I'm also, not here if you don't need me to be here, but really offering support, genuine support.
Great, thank you so much. One more question, and this one's for Randy. This is a question from Florida, and I assume the weather in Florida is much better than it is in Wisconsin. We've barely cracked 50 over the past couple of weeks, so I'm started getting some serious cabin fever. But the question is, how do we get buy-in from local leaders and rank and file members for bargaining for the common good? And I think Terrence alluded to this a little bit. But this idea from members of a union, it's like, hey, this union should be looking out for its members and not really worrying so much about the community. How do we get members to buy into that, Randy?
You have to meet people where they are, and you have to be able to explain why. You have to be able to explain why and educate why the common good and the public good is so important. And the worst thing to do is try to shame them into doing it. Because the moment you try to shame anybody into doing it, you start getting an enemy. Let's have a respect for the good. The amazing thing about, and I've been at this for a very long time. I've had two different institutions or values in my life that have had faced existential threats for their demise over the course of when I've been working in them, public education as well as the labor movement. I heard after Scott Walker, people saying, oh, collective bargaining is dead. And then you have a president who said what he said yesterday. And I was on a couple of other Zooms today where people in different places are saying, I want a union. I need to be empowered. It's like, I don't empower you. We empower each other, as Marche just said. So I have a lot of gratitude and have a lot of grace about the frustrations that people have when they raise them. And just basically, they're taught by people like Trump and others, what's mine is mine. And here's the grievance, and here's the this, and don't care about people. And so we have to get to their better angels through that kind of love and hope and aspiration. We have to get to people's better angels. And what I have found is that when you help people see that what will happen if we do things together for the whole community and the whole community wins, that's going to help them. two things happen. One, they feel much better about life and about themselves. And two, you actually get shit done in a different kind of way than when somebody can just kind of divide and conquer. But it takes education, and we're educators. And the thing I was going to say is that what I love about educators, or frankly, virtually every single group of people that I have the honor to represent, nurses, healthcare practitioners, educators, bus drivers, public servants, higher, adjunct professors, faculty, is that the through line with all of it is that every single person makes a difference that I represent, makes a difference in other people's lives. And that's pretty cool to have the honor to do that. So I think it starts with honoring people, respecting them, doing something that every school teacher knows, which is you meet people where they are and you try to get to issues of common concern and work on a strategy, organize on a strategy to solve them. And you can't solve problems in schooling or communities unless we build coalitions to solve them.
I think that is a great thought for us to wrap this session up with. So thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Thanks to Joe and Kalmanowitz for organizing this. Thank you to Marche, to Randy, and also to Terrence. Joe, I don't know, did you want to make any programming notes or anything? Or
Just wanted to say thank you, John, for leading this. Randy and Marche, just remarkable discussion. We've recorded this and we'll be sharing a link with all the participants. And thank you so much for giving us such inspiration today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.